So I'm Mark, and I'm going to talk to you about ChatGPT and the future of data analytics engineering. So pretty portentous and sort of like a big title there, really. And but what's been interesting is that this is a topic that is obviously very topical at the moment. And for me, as an owner of a consultancy, I was very interested to understand how much of this new technology could replace what we do. Because certainly, as we'll get into in the presentation, there's a lot that it can do that it appears to be as good as a kind of data analyst or an analytics engineer, you know, certainly on the surface. So I was very interested to understand, basically, could this replace me? Because obviously it has a slight worry if you're, if you're running a business that does this, but also just to understand, well, what can it do, and what sort of things can it? What kind of, I suppose, abilities and enhancements and just help can it give you as a kind of assistant, really? Okay, so anyway, I'll go through the presentation. I'll start with not quite as many slides as before, but I'll go into who we are and so on. So we're a consultancy based in Brighton. We focus on the modern data stack. Okay, so I used to work in the world of Oracle years ago. It was good, and certainly it's where the money is in some respects. But you know, I was very interested in, I suppose, what you could do with kind of some of the new technologies. Okay, some of the new technologies and some of the new ways of working. That was, is it microphone cutting out? Yeah. Thank you. Right, that's better. Anyway, so as said before, I've got a blog, we've got a podcast as well. All these topics have been discussed on there quite a bit. So if you're interested in talking to some of the kind of players behind this, then listen to the podcast and basically you'll find lots more on there as well. Yeah, so the team. Now, so there's a few from our team here. So there's Lewis at the back and Jordan there, just sort of say hello. So we're based, where are we? We're based up by the station. So we're based in Spaces. So you say you're moving to Spaces, are you? Is that right? Silicon. Oh, are you? Right, okay. Oh, right, okay. So where are you in Spaces then? Oh, right. Cheapskates then. You don't pay for an office. Yeah. Right, okay. You're one's downstairs then. Yeah, okay, right. So we're based in Spaces, which is nice, and up by the station, and we partner with a whole bunch of these kind of modern data stack firms like Segment and Looker or Google now, Rudderstack, Cube, all these kind of ones. Okay, so that's a little kind of background to who we are. Right, and that's the podcast as well. Okay, so if you want to hear someone rambling and mumbling and stuff for an hour, talking to someone who's really interesting, then that's your place to go to, really. Okay, so what is ChatGPT? Now, who here has heard of ChatGPT? Right. So probably the most pointless set of slides ever now would be an hour's talk about what ChatGPT is, because everyone, my mum would have known that if she was alive, but my wife, my cat, everyone knows about ChatGPT. You know, my daughter knows about ChatGPT because it can do her essays for her. You know, my wife, everyone knows it. I mean, it's a whole kind of maybe separate topic there about maybe product development and product-led growth and so on, because you think about, oh, you need an app, you need a great branding strategy, you need all these kind of things. But ChatGPT wasn't even a product as such at the start. You had to kind of actually hunt out where it was. And I mean, doesn't it show that a good product, like say Google back at the start, will become viral, really, you know? And another story that would be interesting would be the story about Twitter now with the rebrand to X, which is interesting as well, how you can ruin a product like that. But anyway, so ChatGPT, as you are no doubt aware, is a sort of generative AI, large language model type product. Okay. Now, I will not go into the details of what it is at the moment. Because probably someone like Oscar could explain it better than I could, but really that's not what it's really about. Okay, ChatGPT is there. It's a generative AI product that has a chat interface, and you can. The scary, really amazing, mind-blowing thing is that you can chat to it, talk to it, and it sounds like a kind of a normal, rational person, an expert talking back at you. Okay, and that's kind of pretty mind-blowing, really. So you're probably aware of the basic features and technologies and so on behind it. There's an API as well as the actual chat interface, and it's all based on this concept of large language models that are trained on lots and lots and lots of information, then basically predict what the correct answer should be to the question you're giving, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so I won't kind of like suppose to be an expert in that, but I can certainly talk to you about how it applies in our particular area. Right, so initial use cases for ChatGPT. Okay, so we've been using it quite a bit within the company, and so really I'm going to focus really in this presentation on how it applies to the work that we do as a consultancy, using tools like DBT and SQL and all these kind of things. So things you can use it for: sales automation. I'll cover that in a second, how that works. What I hate that word, ideation, but ideation and brainstorming and strategizing, it's really good at that, and I'll explain how in a second. Writing essays for school homework, okay, it's pretty good at that. I mean, I think, again, another interesting story will be how they can actually test students in the future, because you can't use essays. Maybe it'll be oral stuff, I don't know, but the actual just regurgitating of kind of stuff that you've learned, that's gone now as a thing that you can test people on. Marketing content production. So you've now got an infinite kind of blurb kind of generator now. You know, we were when ChatGPT first came out, we were employing the services of a content marketing company, and we were using them to help us create what they call pillar pages, where you create a page of just bollocks basically, but it's got loads of kind of text in there, and it's got lots of links, and it becomes an authority on the website. But the problem is you have to sit there and try and explain to somebody who doesn't know, for example, DBT, what it's all about. And so one exercise we were doing was trying to create a pillar page for single customer review. And in the end, even after weeks and weeks of backwards and forwards trying to explain what these concepts were, it was still rubbish, really. And you look at it and you go, that isn't really any good. But we could then get ChatGPT to produce a page of equally nonsense stuff in like 2 seconds for nothing. So, you know, and you can imagine now a web server that just generates pages of this stuff in response to kind of queries coming through. So that whole industry of writing nonsense to go on websites to attract sort of like clicks and so on, surely will be affected by this. But, okay, other things you can do with ChatGPT, I don't know if you noticed in my slide at the start, this rather interesting picture here, okay? This is actually Brighton in the future, as envisaged by Midjourney, okay? Another kind of like variant of this. So this is Brighton Pier and Seafront, photorealistic, and as if photographed using a drone, but set in the future with hover cars and robots, okay? And so that's Brighton Pier, as envisaged by Midjourney there. You can see it's always got lots of bits there and so on. So, and there's even a hovercraft up there. Okay, so you can sort of see another kind of like instance of this really is in doing pictures and so on, really. Right. So, yeah, no, I'll accept more water actually, please. Yeah, thanks. Right. Okay. So, who here has used the code interpreter plugin for ChatGPT? Yeah, isn't it mind blowing, really? I mean, so one of the kind of the shortfalls of ChatGPT as it stands is that you typically can't give it your own data, and it can't really add up. It can sort of like look like it's adding up or doing maths, but it can't really do anything. You know, if you asked it to, I suppose, you know, refer to a database or a file normally, it just says, well, I can't do that. I'm a large language model, whatever. But the code interpreter plugin is a plugin for ChatGPT that can code and execute Python code. Okay, so it creates a virtual environment and it can actually write Python code and run it in response to your queries. I mean, as someone like me who's a bit of a bluffer with Python, I mean, I really am terrible at doing that. But I am not nearly as good as, say, so Oscar in the past and this sort of thing, doing just basic Python analysis. It can do it, and you know, and it's astounding, really, what you can do. In my experience, it tends to fall over when you ask it to do really, really interesting things, like doing things like segmentation or finding out which of these features have the most impact on this outcome and so on. It runs out of memory, all that kind of stuff. But you know, that's surely an implementation detail. Those are things that you can just fix. But to be able to actually write and execute your own code, that's really interesting, really. So that's the code interpreter plugin. That's another use of it, and I've been using that to do basic sort of stats analysis of my data. There's a product called Delphi out there, which is a plugin to Slack that connects to your semantic layer in Looker or in Cube or in whatever, and it can actually then, it uses a combination of that plus a couple of models, ChatGPT and so on, to emulate or to kind of give you an interface that's like having your own analyst on there. So you can go and say things like, what's our sales been like this week? And it will then have this interaction with you where it asks you, it checks to make sure that the measure that it thinks you're talking about is the correct measure. And it's like having an analyst on there. Okay, again, it falls down pretty quickly, but you can see where things are going with this. So that's another use of it. Now, we've also, on our company, we've been thinking, how can we use this like on our website? So we built a chatbot, on there. But what's interesting is it uses ChatGPT, but it also uses what they call we create what's called embeddings. So we take our content of our website and our data sheets and also pages from our partners, and pass that to it as well. And it then, because this is really in response to a problem we had where I was testing out ChatGPT to see how, if we asked it to recommend a consultancy in Brighton to do, or a consultancy to do this work, who would it recommend, right? And it recommended anybody apart from us. So it recommended like Datatonic, it recommended all these kind of companies, even ones it just made up in Brighton as well. And it just would not recommend us unless we actually kind of said, do you recommend us? And he goes, oh yeah, that's good, So in the end, we got this service where we pass it just our data, and then it answers the questions on the chatbot there from our data, but only our data. So it won't recommend Rittman Mead, for example, or won't recommend kind of, Datatonic. So that's another use for it there. And we've also, this is slightly dangerous, but I've also got it answering my sales emails as well. Okay, which is kind of living on the edge a little bit when you only get a few a week. To actually leave it to a robot to do, but it's scarily good. Okay, so what we do with this is you send an email to assistant@rittmananalytics.com. So if you want to try that at all, it's all live. You can ask it a question like, what do you do? What services do you provide? What your fee structure? It will then again go to that chatbot kind of setup we have. It gets the information on us from there. It then passes that to ChatGPT to turn it into a proper kind of sales response. And it then responds back. And it knows, for example, to try and book a call with me. I mean, it's so good. I don't know how it works. It's amazing, and it's all completely legit and live. And if you send an email to assistant@rittmananalytics.com, it will answer it. Okay. So these are all things that, for the job, if you're doing like a sales admin job or something, and all your job is to answer these things, this does it better than you, really. So that's kind of cheery message there for the salespeople. Right. So there's all these things that I've told you about, which we sort of all know about, really, we can use it for. But on a very personal level, can ChatGPT become a DBT assistant, and can it become an analytics engineer? So before I start, who knows what DBT is? Who's heard of DBT? Most, right. So DBT, for those of you who don't know, is a kind of toolkit, a framework for building data transformations and data warehouses and so on things like Redshift and BigQuery and Snowflake and so on. So really, it's where most of our money comes from as a consultancy. So we started off doing data analytics work at the start, say Looker and Tableau and all that sort of thing. The problem with that is there's no money in it, really. It's something you can do in a couple of weeks. It's not really something that actually creates a long-term project. But DBT work, where you're actually building transformations and the pipelines and clean the data up and all that kind of stuff, is like a never-ending job, okay? And so therefore, a large language model that can do that better than us is an existential threat to us in a way, because that's the thing that we do well, really. So the question here is, can it become a DBT assistant, or even better, an analytics engineer? Right. So I was kind of morbidly fascinated with this. Part of me hopes it could never do that, but part of me thinks, well, actually, if the service we provide to the customer at the end is still the same, but we can get it to be automated, job done in a way. So it's a threat and an opportunity. Right. So how can ChatGPT assist an analytics engineer doing DBT work? Okay. So and I'll start with the kind of the fluffier bits first and get into the detail of it. So the first bit is strategizing an approach to solving a client need using DBT. So one example that Jordan and I at the back there were working on recently was a client of ours they asked that they use NetSuite, and NetSuite is like probably the today's version of SAP in terms of kind of like a very obscure and big kind of schema you work with and all this kind of stuff. And we were asked to do a piece of work to report on mundane purchase orders and item returns. And so the first thing I did with it was went to ChatGPT and said, how would I approach the problem? And I'll tell you what, it was pretty good. It comes back with saying you should try and go to these tables, do this, do that. It's this type of a transaction and all this kind of business. So for that sort of like strategizing, it's really good, okay? Even in its basic form, I'll go into more later on what it can do. Things like enhancing code with descriptions and documentation. So Lewis at the back there. So Lewis, how do we use kind of ChatGPT and GPT in general to, I suppose, just enhance the coding we do now, really, just as an example? So yeah, so Lewis is my number 2 at the company.
Yeah, hello. So I mean, going back about 6 months, we've been using ChatGPT and its API to enrich metadata within our warehouse, so that whenever you build out an entity within a warehouse, it already adds a rich description without you having to do it manually. And these are typically things that people don't do as part of the process, quite long and laborious. But we've gone further than that now. We use it on project management to enrich ticket descriptions and to provide better context around reconciliations. So we really use it in almost every facet of our projects.
Yeah, and so Lewis, that's an open source project, isn't it, as well, that we've got? So maybe just mention that.
Yeah, so Drowty is an open source project that we push forward at Rittman. It works with tools such as Cube, Looker, DBT, DBML. It's definitely worth checking out. Again, we use it in all of our projects, and it decreases engineering workload significantly.
Yeah, so that's a genuine thing that we do now, really, and we open sourced it and so on. So, okay, so enhancing code with descriptions, all that kind of stuff there, all the kind of the mundane stuff. Well, I'm not saying yours is mundane, Lewis, but all the stuff that we should do, right, but often don't do completely. Right, so, but the big thing, can it write entire DBT packages? Can it code something that is a working package of code, okay? Right, so that's the strategy bit. I mentioned that a minute ago, right? That's the documentation bit there. Right, can it create a DBT package? So when we make the slides available, there's a link here, which is actually to the ChatGPT session that I go through in here, okay? So you can see the full thing in there, okay? But I'm gonna give you some excerpts from it and the highlights, okay? So I was thinking to myself, one of the things that I'm very familiar with, and we've built this kind of, again, open source package that is like a consulting company data warehouse. Okay, so we built a kind of a conformed dimensional data warehouse in real life that can store data on things like timesheet projects and things like clients and accounts and all this kind of stuff. So it's something I'm very intimately sort of familiar with how this works. And so I thought I'd start really by saying to ChatGPT, I have a Google BigQuery project, and I'm working for a consulting services business, and I've got basically data sourced from through Fivetran for Xero, Harvest, and HubSpot. Okay, so start by creating a conformed dimensional data warehouse structure, like DDL, effectively, for this data. Okay, so then it comes back and it says, right, okay, here we go. So it creates a schema, and it starts to create like dim tables and so on. And I mean, it's not bad at the start, okay? So first of all, it obviously knows about the data that comes from Xero and HubSpot and kind of Harvest, which is interesting. And that's because obviously they're public schemas that are published by Fivetran in this case. It creates DDL that is kind of uses the right data sets, so it uses the right data types for BigQuery, but it falls down here. It's got, so you can see here, there's a clause here, primary key client ID. Okay. Now, if you're new to BigQuery, or you learned BigQuery a while ago, you'd go, but BigQuery doesn't support sort of like constraints, but actually it does, right? But this has got it wrong. It's actually, I suspect, got that primary key thing there from its knowledge of Postgres, okay? Because actually that clause there is actually wrong, okay? That if you try to use that, the primary key definition in BigQuery is slightly different to the way it's done, okay? So it's kind of, it's almost right. Is it cutting out again? Yeah. All right. Let's go back to this. Right, okay. Cheers. Okay, so it's almost right, but it's not quite right. Okay, so if you try to run that, it would fail, and actually you sort of need to know a bit about BigQuery to know that that is kind of wrong, but it's wrong in a subtle way that perhaps even this doesn't know about. Right, so that's the kind of first thing. Then I say to it, well, okay, so forgetting that, can you turn what you've done so far? Can you turn this DDL into a DBT project? And it goes, okay, fair enough. And so it starts off by going through and telling you how to set up DBT, which is good. Then it runs the package that you use at the start to initialize your project. And then it gives you some code, right? And this is not bad. You know, I'd argue that it's probably better than the majority of people in this room, right? Because some of you don't know DBT at all, so it can't be that sort of bad. But it's not bad. You know, it's valid sort of code. The concepts are kind of like broadly there, okay. But then it does this thing where it's like a really lazy sort of like assistant. You know, it says, right, here's one example, but it only shows you maybe a subset of the columns. And it says, I'll then go and repeat this for other dimension tables. And it's like, well, okay, that's what I asked you to do, really. So then you can go back and say, right, now do it for all of those tables, and it will. But it's like the most skiving kind of assistant you can think of. It's always trying to find a way to kind of like do it on the you know, sort of, you know, with minimal effort. But you know, conceptually, it's getting there, really. And as a sort of starting point, it's not bad. So then I say to it, okay, this is the bit that I know is quite complex. I want you now to create a single record for each entity, so for each company, each contact, and so on in there, so that the warehouse has one record for say sort of Barclays or whatever, and it then will come resolve all the duplicates into that one sort of like record. Now I know that's quite complicated, and Lewis has been doing it in a way using kind of AI in the past. I've got this complex thing with a kind of like a matching table, but it's a non-trivial thing to do. So then ChatGPT says, here's a way of doing it. And then it comes up and says, well, you can use this function called the Jarrow-Winkler function, okay? So anyone heard of Jarrow-Winkler before? It's a pretty obscure kind of, it's a function. It's a thing you get, I think it's actually in Oracle, but it's a function that is a kind of similarity match thing. And you find it probably more in Python and so on. So it says, right, you can use this function, Jarrow-Winkler, there you go. And I'm thinking, wow, this is good. I've actually learned something here because I didn't even know that existed. Maybe it's BigQuery. But actually it made it up. Okay, so it's what's called a hallucination. It kind of confidently made up this function that doesn't actually exist, put it in the code and said, there you go. Okay, so it's like a confident bullshitter, which I suppose is the definition of a consultant in some respects, you know. So if you imagine you just taking somebody on as, you know, come to your company, and they're Charlie Big Bollocks, you know, they kind of know it all and all this kind of stuff, and they're very confidently to the clients tell them sort of like, we do this. Confidence is 9/10 of, you know, being a consultant in some respects, but it's wrong. Okay, it just made it up. And so that's a good example there of when it will make things up. It should be there. Okay, I think one analogy I heard in the past is imagine if your arm was cut off, you know, which is not a nice thing, obviously. Apparently it feels like it's still there for a while. Okay, it feels like it should be there, which is an odd thing. Obviously, I've never tried that myself, but and so I suppose in a way, Jarrow-Winkler should be there. So it basically makes it up and puts it in there, but it's not actually the case. So that's a bit entertaining. That's sort of like, you know, so again, you need to kind of know a bit about what you're doing. So I suppose the worst thing to do would be to say it's all rubbish because of that. You know, it's no more rubbish than a junior developer in your company who got their databases mixed up. Okay, so putting it like that, it's not bad, but it's also not correct. Okay, then I said to it, right, okay, getting into more examples here, I said, right, now go and calculate utilization. Now, will know as well, because we both work in this area. Calculating utilization is a pain in the ass, isn't it, really? And it's complicated. There's lots to it. You've got to do things like date spines and all this kind of stuff. It came up with a really good example. Okay, so again, if I didn't know how to do this, I wanted a starting point to code this in DBT. It's as good as anything, really, but it's not going to be everything you need, and it will certainly need someone who knows what they're talking about to kind of adapt it and use it and so on. Okay, but it's for something that's been out for about 6 months now. it's still scary. It's scary how close it is now, really, to what we want, but it isn't enough yet to do it. Okay. So then I said to it, right, so there's a feature in DBT called the semantic layer, which has been through a few changes over the last couple of years. So I said to it, go and add a semantic layer to it. It went, there we go, right, here we are. And what it recommended, a feature there was a precursor to this semantic layer called exposures a few years ago. So and this is a kind of an artifact of the fact that this was trained on data from up to 2021. So it wasn't aware, apparently, of this newer feature. But that's the thing where the limitation was the kind of the age of the training data. But weirdly then, if you then tell it you're wrong, it then comes up and says, oh, I'm sorry, and gives you a more up-to-date answer. So there's this thing with ChatGPT where it will get things wrong, and if you ask it, you tell it you got it wrong, it goes, oh yeah, so I have, which is kind of weird, you know. So it's like a really lazy and skiving and also very imprecise assistant, right? Which is kind of interesting, really. But certainly it's an assistant with lots of ideas. Okay. Now, another bit where it got good was I said, "What now? Go and document this thing." So put it into a package and document it. So the sort of thing that is dull work that you give to anybody other than yourself to do, and so on. So, but it does this really well. It writes out documentation for you very well. Okay. Now, again, limitations of it so far is it tends to annoyingly forget stuff as well. So if you're going on a very, very long kind of like chat session, it will sort of forget what it knew a little while ago, because what it's doing each time, create this chain of thought, is it's actually sending over all the historical stuff from the chat session with each kind of new prompt. So it knows about what it's done in the past. Okay. So anyway, so I'd give this a kind of qualified, interesting kind of like rating at the moment. Okay. Any comments so far on this? So anyone tried doing this with SQL coding or Python coding or anything else at all? Right. Okay. Have you found it in practice?
Hold on.
Okay.
If I'm feeling lazy, I like to use it to write unit tests.
But it's lazier than you, isn't it? In some respects. Yeah.
It's quite good at making stubs for code that I'm gonna flesh out more.
Yeah.
So I quite like it for that, but I'm quite often using libraries that it doesn't know.
Yes,
so,
that's because of the kind of the time limit for when it was. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, I rate it. I like using it. I don't like admitting that I use it at work though.
Well, interestingly, I wrote the first generation of our chatbot using that, and it was teaching me JavaScript. And so it gives you, as a developer, these additional abilities that you can now write JavaScript. You can do whatever, but it doesn't. It can't substitute for you, but it certainly can enhance what you do. Anyone else tried coding with it at all so far? So yeah.
So it's very good.
Yeah. There you go.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I use it quite a bit. So it's really good at algorithms, I find. Like just now, I needed an algorithm to take a number and number of decimal places, and then increase and then output a string that had at least that number of decimal places, which is a little bit fiddly, and it just did it, which is quite cool. That's TypeScript. I wrote a bunch of Java with it the other day. So the thing there was just to do the classes. So I'd tell it what class I wanted, what methods I wanted, and then we just went back and forth and just say, okay, could you add a method?
That's really good. That's really good.
Python as well. So I made a chatbot integrated with a robot. So you could talk to the robot and it would talk back and it would walk around and stuff. And I hadn't written Python before. And I just worked with GPT-3 and it's
fantastic.
Yeah, it was pretty awesome. I was really impressed.
Brilliant.
I told it what classes I wanted, and again, it just filled in the details.
Fantastic.
I had to fix a bunch of bugs, but
one of my side projects is to try and upload all of my information to these kind of things. So for that last 10 years, I've been recording absolutely everything. So I have all my emails, my messages, everywhere I've been, all the web searches, all this kind of stuff. It's a gold mine if you wanted to blackmail me, and then trying to feed it into one of these chatbots so that I could then put it onto Slack and then not come into work. Because it could then answer all these questions. But then, of course, the flaw in that plan is you can say to it, "What have you done that we want people to know about, or something? Or what have you done that's wrong?" And it would best faithfully regurgitate every single thing that you've done, which is kind of interesting. So that's where the plan falls down. So yeah.
So maybe I have a bit of a different experience. So yeah, great for writing unit tests. But I'm a library developer mainly, as I build libraries. I find it to be next to useless for a lot of the things that I do.
It's like an enthusiastic idiot, isn't it? In some
Yeah.
respects, which
Yeah.
can be fun, you know.
So
yeah.
anything. So yeah, boilerplate. So say
Yeah.
I'm trying to write like boilerplate. Say writing
Yeah.
a Python class, or trying to write like boilerplate for a Rust trait, something like that.
Yeah.
Or like basic kind of some TypeScript types. Maybe you can do that well. But anything that's too complicated, anything that like
Yeah.
you need to care about memory usage,
Yeah.
anything that you need to care about like performance,
Yeah.
it doesn't do any of that stuff
Yeah.
well at all. And
Yeah.
if you look at the metrics, like it can't pass hard code, it can't pass hard problems on leak code. So it's
Yeah.
never going to get hired by Google.
Yes, yes. Okay, so let's get on to where I think this is going, right? So everything we're saying is true now, but I don't think necessarily we can sleep soundly thinking that's it, really. So first of all, there's this kind of, I suppose, what I think is a sort of snake oil industry, which is prompt engineering, right? So this is, everyone just jumped on the bandwagon when this came along, everyone said, oh, it's really kind of rubbish and all that. Then this kind of, I suppose, a group of people came along and said, you should do my prompt engineering course, okay? And every charlatan sort of basically came along and said, we can sort of do this. So the idea is that by structuring your you've got more chance of getting back a consistent response. And there are test frameworks out there, for example, that will do this and try and get every single, but I tend to think this is, again, sort of snake oil, because two things. It's, first of all, the next thing I'll show you, I think will make it redundant, but it's also, I don't know, it's just got that air. It's like SEO. Who does SEO here? Right, it's the modern day SEO, isn't it, really? Because actually, in some respects, again, the problem I showed you earlier when it recommended anyone to do the work apart from us when we asked it, actually, I suppose, in a way, making sure that public kind of LLMs and so on have got as much chance of kind of like responding with your information than someone else's. That equivalent of kind of SEO optimization, I can see that being a thing in the future where, part of the strategy for a business, for marketing, will be to try and make sure that ChatGPT recommends your company rather than your competitors, okay? But also it's got that kind of black box, it will work sometime in the future type sort of thing, which is obviously the hallmark of SEO as well. You don't see any effect for 6 months, well, that's convenient, isn't it? So speaking as a man who spent sort of thousands on that recently. Right. So now where it gets interesting, so we've seen so far that really ChatGPT is a great, though slightly kind of stupid and naive assistant, okay? But it can't think for itself. You have to prompt it with a series of prompts to get it to do what you want to do. So that's where, if someone here used Auto GPT or Agent GPT, this is the thing you go, oh my God, this is going to be the end of the world, right? So self-prompting autonomous AI agents, okay? So this is my chat up line when I go to the pub, really. And the idea of this is that you don't say to it, right, here's a series of things I want you to do in a sequence that builds up to the final kind of bit. You give it a goal, okay? And the goal could be, and you could particularly daring, you could say the goal could be to get myself banned from Twitter or something, or X or whatever, because it can connect to Twitter and do stuff. You give it a goal. And so in this case, rather than me kind of step by step going through that process of saying, can you do this data model? Can you do this DBT package and so on? You give it a goal. And so I've said here, act as an analytics engineer assistant working with DBT, designing and building a data warehouse to run on Google BigQuery that uses DBT and extracted in 5-tran, blah, 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 blah. Here we go. The deduplication bit is in there, and all data should be tested and the package documented. So that's in that's one sentence there that would be like a 6-month project probably for a consultancy. So this thing's called Auto GPT. It's a package you can download from GitHub. Okay, and so what it does then is you've got your goals in there. So the goals include things like monetization for it and so on. This is all me putting this stuff in. And then it starts to actually think for itself. Okay, so it says, right, I need to review the goals and constraints to determine the next command to use. Right, the reasoning for that is by reviewing the goals and constraints, I can determine which command will help me achieve what I'm doing. Then it goes and has a plan, right, which is pretty good. So the plan is review the goals and constraints. Then it starts to criticize itself as well. So it starts to kind of say, right, what can go wrong with this? So it says, I need to be careful to choose the most efficient command to use, as every command has a cost. Okay, that's pretty good. Again, that's probably an advance on most people. And then it then proposes kind of like a next step. And so you can say like yes, or you can be pretty brave and put in yes 100, and it'll do 100 steps without checking with you. And so it then goes off and it spawns off these kind of child agents that go and then do the work for it. So you've subcontracted your work to this agent, to this auto GPT. It then goes and hands off the work to child agents that he spawns off. And then those things start to strategize. And they can also go and search the web. They can go and clone a repo from GitHub. It can then open the thing up. It then reviews the bloody code, right? It can then run the code because it can execute code on the local environment, and so on. So this thing is strategizing. It's spawning off these things, and it's writing code and so on. Okay, and so a good example of what this can do is if you asked it to go and research all the restaurants in Brighton, for example, and actually download the details, put it into a file and so on, it'd be great at doing that. So it's great at doing research, and it also can start to do this for you as well. So this is starting to get interesting, right? Because it's not only just kind of like, responding to your questions, it's actually thinking up its own questions and then actually going and doing the work and all this kind of business. So it's going there and it's going and cloning a repository here. So it goes and I think in this step here, it goes and starts reading the documentation. So it goes and reads, and this is where it gets scary. So it goes and reads the DBT documentation to understand what DBT is, right? And it's like the Borg, isn't it? It has one encounter with you, and it knows what DBT is now. So it goes and reads the documentation about DBT. Then it goes and clones the starter project from the DBT repository, okay? And then it starts to go through it. And it starts to, where are we here? So, and it's getting things wrong, but every time it gets it wrong, it tries to work out what's gone wrong, and it goes on. And so if it can't maybe kind of read this file or something, it goes and reads it a different way, and it's actually kind of thinking this stuff through and reasoning and so on. And so this is a whole different ball game, right? Because it's not just respond to what you're doing; it's actually got its own intelligence, really, which is kind of interesting and also terrifying. So that's all run from. Is anyone, so yeah, who's used Auto GPT? Anybody at all? So what's your experience been then?
I think I first tried it about 6 months ago.
Oh, right, okay.
Probably
Yeah.
whenever it came out. It was new at the time. I thought this is the thing, and I set it on autonomous mode. I said keep going forever, and I gave it the task of, I can't remember what it was. I think I had loads of documentation in Markdown, and I wanted to convert it to Word.
Yeah.
Which turns out is a really difficult task to
Right.
automate quickly in Python. I gave up on that one in the end because it wasn't that important.
Yeah.
But I set it off doing that task and went off to go get lunch. And I came back and it had deleted about 200 files off my desktop.
Okay.
And it was awful. And I was looking
But
through,
entertaining though. Yeah. Yeah.
very entertaining, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, it just sort of gone off on itself and it got stuck in a loop of creating files, and trying to clean up after itself.
Yeah.
And creating loads and loads of completely useless Python files. They were only Python because they said .py after them. There was nothing in them. And obviously, I'm assuming these are more recent. It's evolved since then.
I hope so. Yeah. Yes,
Yeah,
I mean
very-
you can connect it to Twitter, can't you? You can tweet for you and stuff like that. So that is I mean that's a pretty kind of high risk strategy, isn't it? Really, to do that. Maybe that's what Elon Musk has been replaced with. I don't know, but it can also connect to your Git repo and it can raise issues and it can check. That's kind of fun, isn't it? Really, But you can see. But I would argue that this process, where are we here, of actually listening to what you're saying, coming up with a plan, critiquing the plan, that's probably better than most people do, really. I would say that methodically doing this is pretty good stuff, really. Right? And the fact it's wrong 9 times out of 10, leave it going long enough, and it'll get it right in the end, or it will delete all your files or whatever, But it's and again, which version of GPT you use as well is important. So GPT-4 is better than 3.5, which was available until recently, but it's terrifying. Fun. It's a bit like I've got like a Tesla, right, and it's got that sort of self-driving thing in it, but it's got this little frizz on in it that every once in a while it will almost kill you, right? Because it will go under it, and so that adds a little bit of spice to the driving sort of thing. But it's interesting because it probably gets it wrong less times than I would do normally. So it's not perfect, but it certainly makes the life interesting. So anyway, so that's that one there. And so one of the downsides with this, which probably you picked up on, is setting the thing up is a real pain, isn't it? You've got to have a vector database, you've got to have all this kind of stuff and run it like in Docker and all this. So there's also now Agent GPT, which is even scarier, which is putting it all into like a browser. Now it can't execute code and so on, but you can get the same experience really. And this is a great researcher, really. I think it's fair to say. So that's Agent GPT. Now, the concept of actually autonomous agents, you can now get within ChatGPT itself. So you've got plugins here. So there's a plugin here called Prompt Perfect. Another reason I think the prompt engineering sort of thing is snake oil, because you can now just install a plugin to ChatGPT that will give you better prompts, apparently. So I don't know, whatever. You've also got AI agents there. So it actually now has agents in there as well. And there's also plugins that I've been using where it can connect to a database. Okay, so one of the downfalls of using ChatGPT to maybe model data that that's against an existing schema is that ChatGPT won't be aware of your internal database schema. But if you connect one of these plugins here, so this is the chat with your data plugin, then it can connect to Postgres and it can read the data dictionary from Postgres, and then write you DBT code that is actually based on the schema it can see in your database, not just the public one that was available, say, from Fivetran. And so what I did as a bit of a workaround was, because it only works with Postgres, I then connected a thing called Cube to it. So Cube is a semantic layer which can make anything look like Postgres and BigQuery through Postgres. So anyway, so there's a lot of stuff you can do now with plugins, okay, there as well. So can ChatGPT replace analytics engineers? Okay, so what's that law called? That law that says if your headline in your newspaper says, "Is this something or other?" Whatever. Bedwin's law, is it something? It's always Betteridge's law, yeah. So Betteridge's law would say the answer is no, but I'm going to say it's yes in some respects. Right. So there's a great quote on Twitter from Benedict Evans, right, who said, large language models do not answer questions, right? They create things that look like answers to questions that look like your question, okay? Which is quite a clever sort of thing, and I think it's quite accurate in that what ChatGPT is doing is not understanding it doesn't understand DBT and so on, but it understands what kind of like answer should come to the question you've just asked. So a bit like, say, Markov chains and all this kind of stuff. It knows enough about what the correct answer to that sort of question should be to give you an answer that sounds like the right kind of answer, okay? Which is a very long-winded way of kind of saying it's not necessarily that accurate, okay? But it looks authentic. So there's also another quote. So on my podcast, I had Ben Stansel on last week, guy from Mode, and he had a blog post actually recently. He talked about we don't need another SQL chatbot. So again, the kind of gold rush for all this. A lot of people have written these kind of text, natural language to SQL kind of bots, really, right? And the argument he's saying here, which I think is valid as well, he's saying there's obviously much more to it, but he says, because so far, one of the most striking things about LLMs is that they're much better at the creative parts of analysis than they are at the mechanical parts, okay? Ask ChatGPT to write a SQL query against an artificially simple schema, like I've been doing with the ones from Fivetran and so on, and it's a junior analyst at best, right? And you saw that earlier on. It gives you a partial answer and it's skipping bits and so on. But if you ask it to come up with a possible hypotheses to explain why there's some anomaly in the data, or a big open-ended nebulous question, it does better than I would, he said, right? And it's interesting that in a way, LLMs, in my view, they've kind of turned this on its head a little bit. It used to be the case that you would use computers and automation to do the boring drudge things, and it would do them accurately every time and so on, okay? But the stuff that was the thinking, the ideas in the first place, you consoled yourself with saying that, but that's what humans do, right? But actually it's on its head now, because the stuff that's boring and needs kind of preciseness, LLMs do really badly, okay? You wouldn't run a nuclear power station using data from this, right? But you certainly would think about what's your strategy for building a series of nuclear power stations. The strategy part and the creative part, it arguably does better than we would do, okay, which is an interesting kind of concept because, again, scarily, I'd imagine that most of you in this room, a bit like me, who are kind of maybe a little bit too old to be a programmer anymore, but you console yourself by being the fountain of all knowledge and you know strategy and so on. This is the bit it's going to replace in some respects. So I could have a revolution in the company and sort of like, you know, Lewis get rid of me and replace me with a chatbot who will be probably make as much sense as I do normally. But the creative bit, because it's generative AI, it's really good at, but it's not necessarily good at the detail. And if you look at the kind of life cycle of a project or building a package or whatever, then you can sort of see where it falls down. Okay, so if we start with gathering requirements, so ChatGPT only remembers and understands the stuff that you tell it. So if you prompt it and tell it something, it will know. But if you don't tell it something, it won't go and ask you the question. It doesn't say, what about this? What about that? And part of the skill of an analyst, or, you know, when we do our work as a consultancy, is it's knowing what questions to ask, and it's knowing what things, you know, things they don't say, and knowing what questions to ask beyond that. You know, it's that probing round. It's all that kind of stuff there that things like ChatGPT don't do. Although obviously the autonomous thing I showed you a minute ago, that's got much more chance of doing that. But currently, it only knows the things you choose to tell it. Okay. Plus, obviously, it's kind of body of knowledge from its training data. Now, what it definitely doesn't understand is the context of your system. So every example you see of using, you know, what I showed you before, it's a greenfield site. You're building a package where there's no existing data structures around it and so on. What it has no idea about is your existing data model, all the complexities of your data, and the fact that in your database that the data is stored in a funny way and the column names aren't quite right and so on. Now, that's the bit currently that it is not, you know, that's the big flaw in the kind of process currently. It doesn't know about your existing setup. So on that point, it's hopeless. Designing the package, I would say it's pretty good. The only reason I don't give that a green is because it doesn't know about all the context really. But if it was a purely greenfield site, I'd say that the actual design and the strategy is pretty good. Okay. Coding is okay. Probably good as a junior programmer. I mean, with all limitations that I said, but it certainly isn't the finished thing. But it's not hopeless there. Then testing. Well, testing is interesting because it will do testing if you tell it to, but it doesn't necessarily. If you ask it to write you some DBT code, it won't write the tests in there automatically. And again, if you look at what we do as a consultancy, well, it's the thoroughness of the testing and understanding the importance of that and so on. So that bit there is pretty kind of ropey. And then documentation, it's brilliant. Okay, so anything that is about just generating sort of like documentation descriptions, all that, it's really good. So I'd say that at the moment, I mean, it depends if you're a cup half full or half empty person. If you're looking for find reasons for it not to work, there's lots of reasons why it's not good enough now. But if you're looking for something that's going to say, how can I, like the problem with running a consultancy is it doesn't scale. Okay, and you know, as soon as it's bigger, you just add more people into it, your costs rise, and it's kind of you can end up in 5 years' time with a company that's 10 times as big. You make the same money as you did when you had 1 to 10 people. Okay, so you're always looking for things that can boost your productivity and the value of your business without having to increase your headcount, really. Okay, and if you think about what I've shown you so far, there's many ways there in which you can think it could be useful. So, you know, we had some juniors at one point, but the value of them suddenly sort of went down because they were probably not even as good as ChatGPT in some respects. We had somebody answering kind of sales emails. That, again, is a cost we can take out. So certainly there's things in there that are valuable. Okay. So can ChatGPT create a DBT package? Right. So there's that. Right, so the thing about Daleks and stairs, okay, you know, Daleks, well, obviously now they can, obviously with the rocket underneath, they can go up them, but there are things, you know, Daleks, you know, we were saved from the fact they couldn't take over the world because they couldn't go upstairs. And at the moment, you know, ChatGPT, if you're being negative, you'd say it's at best it's an assistant, an enthusiastic, bullshitting, overconfident assistant, okay, and at worst it's a stuck Dalek, okay. It's, you know, little things can stump it. You know, also GPT is a great example of this, which just kind of goes around the loop and all this kind of business. Things that you could solve in 5 seconds, it gets stuck on, okay. So I couldn't replace all the team with ChatGPT now, clearly, and it gets stuck at the most basic things. But those of you who know your Doctor Who will know, of course, about Davros. And the future really is the kind of Davros type thing, okay, where if you can harness the power of these AI, these LLM models, if you can embrace it and sort of see what we can do with it, what things can it do well now, what things do I still leave to myself? You think about if you were an accountant, say maybe 20 years ago, right? You could be an accountant probably and never use spreadsheets, okay? And the accountancies that are still around now are the ones that obviously embrace spreadsheets and Xero and all this kind of stuff. And so clearly, any kind of sane developer or analyst or whatever would be looking to see, how can I use this now? How can I use it to enhance what I do? How can I now code in JavaScript? How can I now understand all the functions in, say, sort of like, Vertica or whatever? Really, to my view, if you don't start embracing this now and don't start using it, then you'll be obsolete, really. It certainly isn't all there yet, but a lot of, I'd say, the limitations that it has now are not those fundamental limitations. They're because of, say, lack of memory, or it's a lack of, say, tokens you can use and so on. And so certainly, well, we're all using it. I mean, Jordan, I'm going to land you in it now. So Jordan, so you're an example, aren't you, of a kind of I wouldn't say just a developer, but you're one of the team, aren't you? But how do you use this in your daily job, really? It's not a setup. He didn't know I was asking this, so he's probably now thinking, oh my God. But how do you use this kind of technology in what you're doing at the moment?
Like use cases, it could be for if there's like a subject area. So it could be if there's a certain business problem in terms of like creating a dashboard that's looking at, say, a certain segment of product analytics. I'll be using it like as I'm working to research, and strategize how to build out that dashboard and the types of questions, and also just to check. I use it to sense check, so I have my assumptions or the questions I want to ask, but maybe I want to soundboard those. So if we're working, say, remotely, and I want to soundboard ideas, I actually find it's useful to soundboard ideas against as well.
Okay. But Louis, I think the other point of it is, Lewis, it's driven you mad sometimes, isn't it? So there was a period when I was coming into the office super enthusiastic about this and telling everybody to use ChatGPT, and you were saying to me, they're all doing this, and they're kind of not quite getting it right. So where can it go? I suppose in the wrong hands, when can it be, I suppose, a negative thing, really?
Yeah, I mean, there was a period where I was relatively skeptical about it, because people were going away consulting with it and taking it at face value, and I would sometimes get in debates where you've been there and done it and you know the answer, and then they would hold ChatGPT as a source against you, and you'd sort of think, okay, I mean, which I suppose in some instances is good because they're getting a second opinion elsewhere, but it can be as dangerous as it is powerful at times.
Yeah, so it's not a kind of silver bullet, really, but certainly there's value in there. Okay, so thoughts on that last bit, really. So so I suppose in a way, what's opinions after that, really? Do you think it's a load of old rubbish, or do you think there's some value in there? I mean, what's your take on it, really? Anybody who's tried to do this or think a little about it? Yeah, okay, yeah.
For your point about ChatGPT and code.
Yeah, basically, or using LLMs in this kind of in the kind of work people in this meetup would do.
Because it can only go up to a junior developer or an analysis. Is that because GPT can only output code at the highest level of which humans can do it, or just below that, unless it trains itself?
I suppose anyone got an opinion on that at all? So why does it? Anyone got a thought on why things like ChatGPT can only be like a junior assistant? Any opinions? Yeah. Okay.
I'm on my way.
Because at the end of the day, it's just generating predictions from its training data. It fundamentally doesn't understand. It doesn't have that understanding that we as humans have. And I think that's a fundamental limitation of the technology.
What does understanding mean, though? So when you I suppose when you learn something, what is that really?
So it doesn't have the semantic. It doesn't have semantics, right? It only has this syntactic kind of like. Well, it's not even syntax, right?
Yeah.
It's just kind of. it's just statistical prediction, right? Which is fundamentally different to having a structured semantic representations of things, which is what humans have, right?
Yeah.
And it's been like kind of the big problem in computer science, right? That how do you do that thing that humans do? It's a problem in cognitive science as well, which is my background. So I think so I think, you know, at the end of the day, if it's just creating predictions for like the most likely thing based on its training data, it's going to reach a ceiling.
Someone at the back there, I'm sure, is itching to say something now. So Lewis, you've done quite a bit of work on kind of semantic understanding, haven't you, with all this? Is it possible? Do you think it's possible for these models to understand the entities and the meaning of the data?
Yeah, I mean it's a complex question to answer. I mean, my background is like philosophy, so I've got a few blogs out there about semantics, and I think strictly speaking, like if you were to take Wittgenstein or something and look at the way that he approaches
every
linguistics,
presentation that Lewis says has to get Wittgenstein in it.
Yeah, like it's cognizant of language games because it understands context and preceding words and how they affect context. I think the thing that it probably is throttled by at the moment is like reasoning. You know, it doesn't really reason. It gives a convenient and efficient initial answer, whereas as engineers, you sort of go through multiple iterations of like the gestation of a thought and a strategy, and you don't just go for the first one. It takes iterations of testing and like failure and successes in order to get to the desired output. I do, however, think that, you know, even going from 3.5 to 4.0 for ChatGPT, its ability to reason and come out with more convincing and accurate responses was radically different. So I don't think we're that far away from it. Yeah.
Okay.
Backgrounds in philosophy. So, you know, what's the difference between, say, what LLMs are doing and what like Searle's Chinese room is doing, right? And so I guess like where do you come down on like a problem like what Searle presents? So my personal view is that Searle was completely right in that the Chinese room doesn't understand language, but he was right in his conclusion, but he was very, very wrong in his reasoning. So I think within like kind of that field of philosophy of cognitive science, there's people that like to draw this distinction between semantics and syntax, right? And so like how language and cognition works is it seems that there's some kind of semantic, there's some kind of syntactic engine that is just like, you know, doing things in a way that like respects the semantics. And people have sort of struggled with how to reconcile those two things. So some of the work that I've done is looking specifically at like, you know, how can we collapse the distinction? How can we think about like, say, like representations, like, you know, semantic representations being carrying syntactic structure with them? And how can we think of computation and things like that in a way that where we can mechanize the process so that it works on the syntax, right? In a syntactic sense, which is like kind of easy, which is sort of easier to do, but in a way that respects the semantics. And the way that LLMs work, they don't work like that. They do something else. So I think there's a fundamental limit to the technology. I don't think it's like necessarily impossible to kind of mechanize these things. I think that the technology that LLMs work on is like it's not it, right?
Yeah, and a good example of that is like again, like if you look at written language or like spoken language, put it in business context, when you talk to a customer about something like a sales order, an invoice, or gross revenue or net revenue, it's interpretive. Like net revenue might mean one thing to one business and another thing to another business, although they're exactly the same domain. And that's where LLMs fall down, because they wouldn't like actually understanding the difference. Like Derrida would say that the difference and the difference, you know, in French, that there's two words for the same thing effectively. And the only way you can tell is by the written word. And LLMs fall over there a little bit And I think that speaks to what you were just talking about.
Because that's really interesting. That's kind of pub talk now.
Yeah.
So yeah. Anyone else got any opinions on this at all? So the front, yeah. So who hasn't spoken yet? Yourself, the jumper. Yeah, there you go. So what's your opinion?
So I need to be using this more, but story from just today at work. So I was
where is work for you? What do you do?
So work is a SCADA system. So data collection, but not really. It's more just about presentation of alarms in what we do. But yeah, data. But I'm more sysadmin. But obviously, data in logs and such like is still useful data in my world.
Yeah.
But yeah, ChatGPT, great tool. You know, give me a function that does this in Python, etc., etc. Never works, but it gives you the right.
Apart from that,
yeah, the fact it doesn't work, but it gives you the right sort of train of thought, which I think exactly backs up what you were saying. And today, the guys, I asked them to do a bit of a script. One guy sent me back a one-liner. It was like, yeah, that'll work. Yeah, wrap it up in some system D. And then it's like, oh, no, I've done a better one. Here you go. And it was like, oh, wow, this is really good. Didn't work again. But, go away and test it.
Yeah.
But my question to the group is, the times I've used ChatGPT and you're doing a sort of two-way conversation, it feels very human. And you're like, oh, I don't like what you've done with that, or make that better, or make it a bit shorter. But especially when you correct it and it goes, oh, I'm sorry about that. And you go, that's fine. No worries. Great answer you came back with, though. But does that go back into the learning model? And then how does that get validated as good or bad learning?
Okay. Anyone got an answer for that? I've got one, but yeah. Anyone answer for that at all? Yeah, green.
That's still your answer.
Okay, no, you please go ahead. Yeah, I'll just say I was going to say that afterwards.
It doesn't learn directly from what you talk to, from what you say to it. No, training the thing takes ages and it's really super expensive, so it can't be iteratively learning. But
what's it called? It's
in the lifetime of the conversation. Yes, it's storing the chat history, and the whole chat history is being passed back to it. So yes, it learns in that context.
Well, it's optionally being sent back, isn't it? Yeah.
In the long term, yes. They'll take your conversation and they will use that for future network training, but not immediately. It'll be months.
If you've using the free version, because if you use the paid version, so the paid version or the API doesn't by default send it to the actual to be learned again. Because I think after Samsung sent their entire chip designs to there. So if you use the paid version, then you're okay. But certainly I think there's a difference between training a model and fine-tuning a model, and actually it becomes something the model actually learns. And there's also then sending embeddings and basically it does a semantic search of what you send through. So if you went to that service we use for our kind of like our chatbot, it takes all our content, slices it all up, puts it into a vector database, and then when you put a query through, it goes and first queries that vector database using a semantic search, sends three kind of like best results from that to ChatGPT, which then formats it into an answer. So, but it's not the same as it being actually learned by the model. But is that not purely a technology and time thing, though? Because even now, Llama 2, for example, you run it on your laptop. You can, in theory, you better build your own actual models. Yeah, that's just purely a technology thing, really. But any other thoughts on that at all? Yeah, there.
Thank you very much. So I was really wondering, so I've got a colleague, he programs in R. I program in Python.
Is it Oscar?
I won't name names.
Oscar.
So how good would it be in translating my Python code, say a matplotlib to something in R? Would that be something good?
Yeah, and that's interesting. So converting between two different languages, that's actually an area I've had genuine success with. So get it to convert from, say, LookML to, say, Cube, whatever the Cube language is for semantic models. It does that well. And so, and the more that you can give it examples of what you want, and the more that you can kind of be clear on your question, it can do that sort of thing. Well, is anyone else tried to do that at all? Anyone else tried to do translation between languages? I mean, my experience is genuinely that's useful, really. So that's quite a good thing. And going between, say, Python and R, it does that pretty well. Really, obviously not as good as we could do now, but it's a sort of task it can do quite well, really. Anyone else got any comments or questions at all? So yeah, red top there.
Hi.
Hi.
There's a lot of use cases It could be something like a consultant using ChatGPT for building a sales pitch. It could be having to read data in a table. Security concerns around this. So security is something people talked about quite a lot a few years ago. GDPR scared the hell out of a lot of people. People sharing data with it, people allowing auto I'm saying it the wrong way around now. How can you guarantee customer data is going to be shared externally? How can you guarantee that files won't be shared? People using it for malicious activity.
It's interesting, isn't it? And that's where it gets boring, really, in a way. You know, remember the old days of the internet when there was no GDPR and there was no kind of like, all that sort of stuff. And it's so actually there was a slide that I had in this deck that I used at the DBT meetup in London. I got a real roasting over it, and so I kind of took it out really to avoid that point, really, because we have a version of that chatbot that we run internally, and I've fed all of our project notes into it, so it knows about all of the kind of projects we've done. I can say where have we done attribution at, what did we do on this project, right? And it can come back and say to me, we've done attribution at these projects, or we've done these things there. But there's a very good question there, which is where does that data go? Right now, I know that in our case, it's being fed into that my Ask API service. So I know that it's going into a vector database that we control, and then that data isn't going to ChatGPT. But I think the kind of next evolution of all this is when all the kind of suits come in and start talking about GDPR and things like that. Because once you fed this data in, you know, it's kind of out of your control. It's being, you know, it's an interesting area. And I suppose governance and control of all this is going to be interesting. I think certainly trying to, in a way, to try and stop this stuff being used at all is not going to work, because all it will take is a country to start using it. But yeah, I think there's a whole world. And so when we were up in London, and we were presenting alongside a bigger consultancy, and all of their pitch was about the governance side of it and GDPR and all that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, I think absolutely there are questions to be asked there. And, you know, at the moment, I've been playing around with it as a developer and so on. But yeah, I think privacy and GDPR and all that are big things to think about. And yeah, I don't know the answer to it, but it's certainly something to consider. Anyone? In fact, there's a gentleman I was speaking to earlier who's a lawyer, right? And you're not getting out of this now, right? So you were thinking about this, weren't you, in your context? And I mean, just put it on the spot there, really. You know, what do you think the legal opportunities are and the legal ramifications of some of these things are? Just yeah, Mike. Is there a mic somewhere?
I mean, we're looking at all of those things. So we're looking at client confidentiality. So, you know, people are using things like Chat PDF. They're uploading contracts and they're querying contracts and saying, well, okay, I don't need a lawyer anymore because actually I can just use Chat PDF to query this contract and find out about it. But actually, somebody made earlier about training these models. So when you upload that contract, you're training everybody on your confidential information. And so suddenly everybody's got access to that. So how do you protect against that? And then, you know, this whole issue about prompt engineering. Well, if you use the same prompts, you're going to get the same outputs. Okay. So then who owns that? And how can you use that? And is that, you know, you've got cases in the US where lawyers are being sued because they've used ChatGPT to create legal documents which contain hallucinations, which haven't been checked. So, you know, judges are sanctioning them. So how can you be sure about the outputs that you're getting? So, you know, I think one of the points you made earlier was, you know, it's about the creativity and the strategizing and what can it do? And it's only as good as junior developers. Well, it might be as good as junior lawyers, but, you know, that next level that you need, it's not as good as senior lawyers, right?
Well, what about if you're into one of the big legal firms in London? There must be hundreds of people they employ there as juniors that just do research and just kind of go through laws and case law and all that kind of stuff. Surely that is something that you can imagine would be
absolutely. And we've got, you know, we're using legal AI, which we're using for contract analysis.
Yeah,
and it's not going to replace lawyers.
Yeah,
it's just that they won't be doing those same tasks. Okay.
Yeah.
So ChatGPT isn't going to eat your lunch, but a lawyer who's using it is going to eat your lunch.
Yes.
Right. That's a paraphrase of somebody much cleverest phrase that they've used, right?
What friend you used, mate? You said it, yeah. Yeah. How are we doing for time then? I think we have to probably finish soon, don't we? So any more thoughts, any more ruminations on this? Yeah, the blue shirts.
More of a, I suppose, question than rumination, or possibly both. As somebody directing a consultancy company, what's your impression on the current and sort of near future uptake then within large firms? Because I was told recently that actually KPMG's banned the usage of it amongst their developers within the company. So with the talks of security and the legal aspects of it,
I think it's an interesting one. I mean, I can't imagine the likes of KPMG will be able to have a blanket ban on using LLMs and so on, but they would have a blanket ban on using the public version, free version of ChatGPT, where everything by default becomes training data for the next version. So that's your worst nightmare. That initial kind of few weeks when everyone was just using it, not paying for it, and it was all being sent as training data. But I can't imagine that they would say, you can't use the paid version, or you can't use our own internal LLM. Because the next thing, obviously, is training your own LLMs, really. So I think I get the impression that's more down to that kind of loophole in a way of all your data is training data for the free version. I mean, I would have thought that beyond that, how could you not use this stuff? I mean, it's just an obvious thing you want to use, really. But you wouldn't necessarily put it all into you wouldn't make it sort of like just public training data, really. And what's anyone's thoughts on that at all? Is anybody here in their firms had a ban on using this sort of stuff? You have, really? Excellent. So what was that then for?
So I actually work in education, which
right.
is very controversial at the moment with AI, because we went through all the steps of going, AI exists. Over half of our students have submitted an essay using AI.
Which schools you look after?
Baswick.
Oh shit, my daughter goes there, so it's just at A levels. Yeah.
But yeah, the amount
my
of
name together with
students
hers.
using just ChatGPT stuff comes in, and it's usually pretty obvious.
It's almost too verbose and too baroque, isn't it, and stuff and that sort of thing.
It repeats itself again and again and again, which students do anyway when they're blagging. But so it's same kind of marks either way. But yes, that we had an element of we're not using this to we've got to start using this to now encouraging where every teaching staff, support staff are helped to sign up to do lesson plans with it. And we're still in very early stages, but it's trying to work out what is the best way to do this. How can we make flashcards? How can we teach the students to make their own flashcards? They're not going to read the 5 textbooks we've given them. But if we can get them to query an AI on those textbooks, that would be amazing. Can they get them to query 10 pages, make flashcards based on those pages, study them themselves? Can we go through 2 stages of handing in homework where you first hand it into the AI and then it gives feedback on the really obvious stuff?
Interesting.
And then to teaching.
It's like an arms race, isn't it? Because my daughter was at Baswick and she was doing, so she's on the other side of it, really. And the first thing they experience is, this can write my essays for me. This is just wonderful, But then it gets to be a more nuanced use of it to actually do your research. And the flashcards thing is interesting. She spent ages creating flashcards for all her stuff she's doing. And is it the creation of the flashcards? Because I know that if I write notes down, the very act of writing the notes down is how I remember it. And if I just get presented a sort of summary of it, then it kind of like, in a way, the end result looks the same, but I haven't learned during it. So it's how you harness these things without missing that thing that actually was the learning process in the first place, really. But even like essays, I mean, imagine if you do essays at Baswick, is that even going to be a valid way of assessing people in the future? Because that could be gamed now, can't it, really? Or I don't know, I'm sure you thought of it as well, but...
Well, we're all doing a lot of thinking. There's not a lot of answers yet. Especially subjects which are just essay and coursework based. That's the big scare at the moment. Because put a student in an exam, they're writing it in the exam, they're probably fine, right? Because they're not gonna, they're not gonna re-quote stuff back at you from ChatGPT. But when we're submitting, 8 months long coursework, especially with computer science, which I do a lot of work with, and they have to build a game or build a project, and the amount of them that are submitting code written by AI with comments written by AI.
Because my son was there a couple of years ago and he had to write a program. He had to learn, in the last few weeks, had to go and learn this environment to create a game like in Unity or something. But he learned a lot from it. And actually now he's gone to form a company environment. He's got his own design in place. But if it'd been coded for him by ChatGPT, he could well have actually passed that exam, but wouldn't have learnt that stuff that is important, really. But then again, actually, he could have, if he'd have learnt it and enhanced what he did with a kind of like a GPT model, that'd be even better, wouldn't it? So it's kind of using it, and it's like not cheating, but it's using it as a tool, bit like a calculator or a spreadsheet, really. You know, that's interesting though that you're there on the other side of it. Really, you must be really at the coalface of all this, really, because there's nothing more inventive than a lazy student, is there? Really, you know, or someone who wants to pass their exam. You know, you've got the infinite time and kind of like infinite motivation, really. So. Any other thoughts at all? Oscar, what's your thoughts on it? You've kept score, you know, a kind of a diplomatic sort of silence, but what's your thoughts on it?
Well, I was going to be mysterious until we hit the pub later, but
I saw your eyes light up when I talked about what is the process of learning. So, you know, but yeah, what's your thoughts?
Well, I think, me personally, I believe that these systems have already proven their ability to reason with abstract concepts, and that it's simply a matter of scale before they reason at abstract level that we as humans will never be able to understand. And where that takes us when these systems have connectivity and agency is a complete mystery.
Come on. But what do you think about this question about?
Okay, I'll add to that to reduce the cop-out. It's still a cop-out, but I'll reduce the cop-out by saying that generally interactions between the lesser and greater intelligences don't fare well on the lesser intelligences. So it is a scary prospect.
So that on that doomy note there, you know, that's true though, isn't it? I mean, it's kind of interesting. So, but perhaps that question about learning, right? So there's always a debate around how different is what LLMs do and the way they learn things different to what we do as humans? Because the criticism is that all they do is know the best answer to give for a given question. But isn't that learning?
Yeah, it is.
Maybe it's not understanding, but it's learning.
I don't know what understanding really is. We are a neural network, and we learn from examples. All the hierarchy of semantic versus syntax comes to our neural network from input, from training input. We operate statistical inference in our heads, and we build a model of the world. So do these models. So do the large language models. Those models have shallower context. So often when we see a large language model do something inane and stupid and to us simplistic, they are operating on a shallow context. And that's a problem of scale, not of kind. With a deeper context, human level depth of context, I don't see a fundamental difference in the intelligence of these and ours.
And that's why it's interesting and scary and really kind of exciting, isn't it, really? So on that bombshell, then I think I'll finish now. But yeah, yes, no.
Can we? You've been great in indulging us and having this chat and answering question after question, but we do have a question from the remote attendees.
Oh, do we? Right. Okay.
And I'd really like to thank them for tuning in by forwarding that question. And that question revolves about whether you can quantify the value that LLMs have had on your business today in terms of the cost and the benefit that you've drawn from these models, in terms of the chatbots you build, and in terms of the tools you're building for using them as a DPT project builder.
The answer is no. I mean, really being honest, I'm not sure I've been measuring. But I think in practical terms, we probably were less keen on having juniors, because I think we kind of knew that a lot of that will be. Think about a consultant. Lewis made this point actually a while ago when we were talking, that in these days when budgets are tighter, right, if you're actually going to hire a consultancy, Well, Lewis, you tell that story. What was your thesis on this really about what clients want when they hire a consultant these days, and why a junior maybe isn't what they're after?
Yeah, I mean, there's a long and a short answer to this, but like the economic climate's changed a lot, and clients expect from consultants now real value. There isn't the sort of like there isn't the same sort of like flooded market we had with VC funds where there's just a lot of liquidity around, and they're almost happy with anyone just to get things moving. They're expecting more from people now, and juniors get put in the limelight in that situation because they don't often offer an awful lot of value. And if you then hold that against something like ChatGPT that can give a similar level of competency, it makes it really unattractive. And it's something that we've spoken about because it makes it potentially difficult in the future to get your foot in the door for people who are trying to go through internships or graduate schemes. If you're held up against the competency of ChatGPT, it's interesting. I could provide a bit of context about like what is the actual value that it contributes towards the business. I mean, I alluded to this earlier, but I don't think there's an area where we don't use it now for things like getting wireframes for reconciliations, prompting JIRA tickets, writing documentation within our warehouses, writing code or getting wireframes for code. We use it almost everywhere. And I would say that the net value of that is actually relatively high.
So is that in revenue or is that in saved costs, do you think? Or both?
Well, I mean, like if you look at we write documentation using it in terms of like things that customers like about a well-documented warehouse that's rigorously tested, it helps in that. So I would imagine it would help with retention. But in terms of net like saving costs, it would directly output. Because you're just saving time in almost.
Well, you think about really, a couple of juniors that we were probably a bit more not harsh on, but a little bit more high. We had a higher standard to sort of meet really, and even like the sales guy we had in as well, who was just answering emails. I mean, that stuff now we do using this, so it's been cost savings, and I think at the moment that's what a year ago it was all about growth really in our market. Now it's about doing things efficiently, right? And so for us, we're no different. Okay, so last year we basically expanded to a point where we had kind of more costs than we had income, right? Because we were anticipating growth in the market. So what we did was we cut back, as you should do, but we've been using this technology to be able to do more with less, really. So I'd say that financially, it's been. We don't actively measure it, and we don't try and be the cheapest in the market and so on. But certainly there has been a financial benefit to us, really, or at least it's allowed us to kind of, I suppose, grow our business without necessarily growing headcount, which is got implications because that's what we do as a business.
Yeah.
So yeah, Lewis.
And there's also there's profit opportunity with it as well. Mark was talking about Delphi earlier, who one of our bigger customers got engaged with a couple of months ago. So there's this whole emerging market of LLMs that like communicate directly to a semantic model, and really the way that people interact with data at the minute through viz tools is really poor. Like dashboards are a bad way of consuming data. A better way, arguably, is through discourse and dialogue. And that's already happening with tools like Delphi. And there's a plugin in ChatGPT, isn't there, where you can chat with your data?
Well, you think about that example we had where the client of ours said we're actually actively not going to hire as many data analysts now because we're going to do it using LLMs and that sort of thing. And so that's actually, I mean, the implication is that's quite. In a way, wouldn't it be the great irony of all this that it's actually our jobs that have been disrupted by this technology in the end, and not bin men and kind of like and shop assistants and kind of all that sort of thing? It'll be because in a way, the creative stuff is what this does well, and that's what we do. So the great irony is that we could end up out of work, whilst if you work in a sort of hairdressers, you'll be well made really because you can't replace that. So, but it's an interesting area really. And certainly to answer the question, I mean, it's more about cost savings for us. But yeah, certainly there's been a direct impact for us really. Okay. Any other points? Someone else had their hand up. Yeah, at the back. Yeah.
This is like a tool. You could use at any level. So I kind of disagree in that you can't take junior people and use this tool to up their game.
Oh yeah, you can. Yeah.
So
yeah.
I don't, as a father of a recent graduate, I don't want to make it feel bad. This is a tool you use like anything else. Like your daughter uses it to write better essays, and they're being taught how to use it. In fact, it's second nature to them.
Yeah. I'd say Yeah, absolutely. And so the other way of putting it is, it makes everybody, even those junior people, very productive. And that's a much less dramatic way of putting it, and it's much more kind of nice thing. But yeah, absolutely. You know, it means that a junior can be much more augmented and enabled really by this sort of technology as well. But I think another area it could affect, if you think about the classic sort of offshoring market, where you have to very, very kind of like precisely specify what you want, and you send it off to some kind of like faceless kind of person on a sort of like a chat service, and they come back with something that's kind of sort of what you want, but not quite what you want. And it goes, that is sort of what ChatGPT does. So again, it could end up disrupting the offshoring market. So who knows? But like a lot of all these technologies, you know, you don't know where it's going to go really, and you certainly start the ball rolling, but nobody really knows where this is going to go, and it could end up putting us out of work. It could make us the most valuable people in the world. It could, you know, it almost certainly will have, in the same way that the internet enabled things like offshoring and so on. It can have big sort of like effects in the future, but who knows? I mean, you know, it's interesting though. I'm glad that I'm 55 rather than 25 when it comes to my career. Although actually, interestingly, it's in the same way. Who'd want to be an accountant in the days when there were no calculators and spreadsheets? You know, it's so certainly it makes things very interesting. But I think if I said I knew what the answer is, I'd be lying. But certainly it's interesting. Yeah.
Do you think a good analogy is like, do you know like chess AI?
No, but I can chess AI.
Like, chess ELO?
I've played chess. Yeah.
So,
it's as in chess, the board game.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think the highest ranked human's probably like 3,300.
Right.
And I think around in like 2000, that's when AI took over like humans in terms of ELO.
Yeah.
And right now ELO for like chess AI is around 4,000. And I think that's what ChatGPT will be like in 10 years.
But is that not a different? I mean, because that's a very bounded problem, isn't it? Really, sort of chess.
I was going to say, it's, if you can compare like ELO as in that's a quantifiable way of measuring intelligence.
Right.
And if you use the analogy of ELO is comparable to like intelligence.
Yeah.
Then ChatGPT will just overtake it, and then the problems and stuff it deals with is like beyond human capabilities.
Were you posting on the DBT meetup sort of chat Slack group about this? There's someone who's posting on there about this. Was it you? I don't know. Someone was asking about this as well. But yeah. Anyway, yeah. Very good point. Very good point. Yeah.